Alrighty, so I do have my Strathmore 18 by 24 inch uh, sheets of paper lined up with some blue painter's tape. Now, I know a lot of students were inquiring previous quarters of like really utilizing this tape as a medium itself, and I think by also covering up some of the negative space to kind of leave as our whitest brights in terms of value. We're going to use that for the actual demo itself, so we'll put that into practice. Let me go over some of the materials. Again, I have my droplet India ink here. I have 2 paper towels. I have 1 small and 1 large brush that I'm going to be using. I do have this glass container, which I need to fill with a little bit of water to sort of dilute it. I'm just going to put this on the side. And I do also have a sort of bottle of Sumi ink, which is sort of an optional material that you could use. Now, a lot of students also ask and inquire what the difference is between the two. What I've noticed is that the more you're using the India ink, the ink on the actual left is a little bit cooler in terms of color, and the Sumi ink is much richer in pigment. It's much more blacker, if that makes sense. The best thing to do is to also, I'm going to make a value scale first, and then we can come back to the actual landscape, and then we'll put that into practice. I'm going to move all of this. Let me fill my container with a little bit of water. And I like to also just for the sake of the assignment, this is about a few ounces, just a little bit of water. I just like to leave my brushes in here. You could use any container. You could use old yogurt containers like that are plastic, but really there's no right or wrong container to use. You could also use a palette like this here, which was sort of is available in any art store. This one's from Dick Blick. This sort of 6 containers or 6 sort of sockets that you can make different values. So it can add droplets of water on each individual one to kind of give a ratio of, let's say, 1 to 1, 1 to 10, and then so on and so forth. And we'll talk a little bit about this, how we can use that. Let me just grab some tape. And this is crucial in this process, to use the blue painter's tape to kind of block out some of my negative space. Now, before I start off the landscape, adjust my camera, I'm gonna flip this sheet of paper, and I'm actually gonna make a value scale by using both mediums. And again, this is how we sort of start off any process, just to get familiar with the material, but also understand how we dilute and how we sort of manipulate the ink to our advantage. If we have any questions or concerns, feel free to speak. Again, I won't be able to see anybody during the demo, so just feel free to speak and remember to state your name so we can ask our questions. Actually, my blue painter's tape is kind of not straight on that side. Perfect. Okay. Now, again, the reason why I'd like to tape my actual edges of my actual sheets of paper is because the more I add water, the more it gets diluted, and the more it starts to buckle and starts to make a series of waves onto my sheets of paper. And again, you really want to work gradually and actually add a little bit of water at a time and not sort of overwork too much in this process. And really, again, kind of have fun with this because the ink is also very, very loose. It starts to bleed more outwards in terms onto the paper. So I want you to think about that process as well. Really take your time do not rush this process. This should be a more sort of time-consuming, patient medium. So I really want you guys to start to understand and really discover the vocabulary and the language of ink wash with this sort of trial and error, okay? So what I'm gonna do, actually, I'm gonna start off with my big brush. I'm just gonna take my small brush, just leave it on the side here. I like to have a sort of paper towel at my end of my actual paper, so I can always blot it and not have too much water on there. But what I'm gonna do is actually add, and again, you could use any container you would like, but just for the sake of the demo, I will use this sort of palette here. I'm gonna add on the top right. Again, you wanna sort of just like make sure your India ink is nice and closed. Give it a nice shake to kind of just wake up the ink. Just be really careful, don't spill it everywhere. The ink is extremely difficult to remove if you have it on your actual clothing. So remember to always wear non-valuable clothing if you can in this process. I'm gonna add 1 drop of the ink and actually add, leave my water up here, wet my brush, and just slowly blend that first drop of ink. And as a pre-test in that process, I'm going to take my time. Actually, I should have my container close by, so if there's any drops that come off, I could always come back to it. You can see that I already decontaminated my clean water, so it starts to look like this. There's nothing wrong with, but I just have to be mindful of that. And what I'm doing is sort of making a value, okay? I'm gonna make sort of 4 swatches just for the sake of the demo, so we can see those differences. Add a little bit more. And before I actually apply it on my paper, I actually like to apply it on my paper towel, and that would be the sort of first swatch that I make. And I'll actually make it right about here. And I'm, again, not working too much in terms of adding pressure onto my sheet of paper. And I do apologize, the glare, there you go. I'm gonna cover it with my hand of my ceiling because the light is sort of giving an overexposed glare. You can see that's my first swatch. And I'm gonna let that dry, okay? So part of this process is really about the time that you use to wait for the ink to dry. You do not want to rush this process. If you do, you will see the difference of rushing it from wet to wet or dry on wet. And we'll talk a little bit about that process when we get into the actual landscape. And in terms of the painting process, if we're ever working with dry on wet, that means a dry surface on to the wet medium, okay? If it's wet on wet, you will wet or blot your entire sheet of paper, depending on how large it is, and you would apply the ink directly onto the wet sheet of paper. So that's a wet on wet and dry on wet medium or process when you're working with your inks. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm gonna take my brush, wet it in my container, like to blot it on one side, and I'm gonna leave that on the surface. I'm now gonna take my second sort of container on the top left here, take my India ink and add 3 drops. Actually, let's add 2. 2 is more than enough. you will really want to work gradually. This should last a good year, all of this ink, if you're really working with your India ink or your Sumi ink. Your Sumi ink should probably last 5 years. And it's not going to dry out because you can always wet it later on, and then it will become a liquid. Once it becomes a solid, add a little bit of water, and then it becomes a liquid. And then we'll put that into practice, actually. So I think a lot of students were inquiring about how does that actually physically work, which is interesting because I actually had an older drawing I was working on with ink. I'm gonna add a little bit more water just to dilute this swatch here. And the minute I added a little bit of water, and this was around 15 years ago, it started to dilute to become more of a liquid from a solid, which was interesting. Just sort of diluting this process. I'm gonna add a layer, and that's a little too dark. I just added a little bit of pressure onto my paper towel. Let's do it again. Still a little too dark. Really mixing it in here. And again, you could use plastic plates. You could use pretty much anything in this process from a palette. You do not have to use this palette here that I'm using. You could also use containers of yogurt or even other plastic containers. Just make sure it's clean before using. Let's see how this looks. That's a little better. Yeah. Alrighty. You can see now the glare is gone on my first swatch. And keep in mind, the minute that you apply a mark on your sheet of paper, it will dry a little darker. So keep this in mind. Let's make another swatch. Really taking my time. I don't want to rush this process. I really want to enjoy it and kind of put myself in a meditative stage to really have fun with my ink. I don't want to overwork it. I don't want to underwork it. You just cover up that shadow. So you can see there's a big jump, but I'm going to wait for that to dry while I move on to the next swatch. So I'm going to take my India, go to my middle right. I'm going to add 3 drops. Oop. Need a little bit more. Get Annika in here. Okay. Now, sometimes a lot of students also face the dilemma whether or not to always switch out their paper towels. It's up to you. If you don't want to and you just want to use one just to sort of blot out your ink, you could also do that as well. I'm gonna add a little bit of water. And I'm not cross-contaminating any of these. Oop, I actually just did. But for the sake of the demo, obviously it didn't get into any of the swatches. It got onto the sides, which is still completely okay. But really, you want to take your time. Water. Okay. That's good. So the next swatch. You can see there's brush marks onto my surface, which is fantastic. I need to also consider the fact that this area to my right is still a little wet, and I'm already noticing they're starting to bleed, meaning one swatch is going over the other, which is okay for the sake of the demo. But when I'm working on my landscape and I want to sort of factor in that one side is a little wet, so I need to wait for that to dry, I need to remember that before I add a darker color next to it. And you can see these bleeds that run through over to the next swatch, which is okay. But just for the sake of the demo, let's add the last swatch. I'm gonna add 4 drops. 2, 3, 4. Again, a little bit goes a long way. I'm actually happy this is happening because it's just for the sake of the demo, we can see the differences between the two. Dilute with a little bit of water. And I always get the question, how do I erase in ink? It's really depending on the time. Meaning, for example, we just applied this swatch about 30 seconds ago. If I'm not happy with it, I could take a paper towel, sort of blot it on one side, just to keep it a little bit wet, and just sort of slightly dab into that area on the surface of the paper and sort of slightly remove it. You don't want to apply too much sort of smearing or too much pressure or too much gravity because you will start to damage your paper. So if you made a mistake, it's really handy to have sort of a paper towel, a wet paper towel nearby, just sort of as your eraser, and sort of quickly remove the ink that you've actually applied. And we'll put that into practice. Add the last swatch. This is really dark, but I like to see how dark that actually becomes. This is with a little bit of water. And I'm gonna let that dry. You could also add a little bit of water onto that surface. And let's say, for example, I'm gonna make another, I'm gonna separate these two. Just blot into using my side of my brush. You could also, again, hold it as a 90-degree angle if you would like. You don't have to. There's really no wrong way to do this. I'm already seeing, and I know it's a little bit blurry, hold on, you can see there's sort of 5 swatches now. So it's from the right all the way up to the left. This one's slightly grayer, but I'm now noticing the paper starting to bend and wave or buckle. And this is important to remember because if I work over that surface, it gets more and more sort of abstract, as well as it starts to buckle too much and there's too much water on that surface. If I'm not happy with that, I need to wait for this process to dry. Then I can go back and work on it again because it's really important to be patient in this process. That's why we have 2 weeks for this assignment. It'll be due on the 25th, next week. So those of you who have already started from last week, again, you've known the process of really understanding what happens when you start to apply too much water onto your sheet of paper, okay? So does this make sense? Questions about this value? Okay. I'm gonna just sort of spill the remaining swatches into my container. And now, I'm just gonna clean out some of my surface area. Now let's try, here's a new sheet of paper towel. I like to fold it so it can get sort of a double layer. I'm gonna now start to use, before I start with the Sumi, I'm gonna clean off this dirty water. And again, you really wanna spill this in a non-contaminated disposable sink or even a toilet. This is not harmful, but I would not recommend putting this into your kitchen sink. That could actually get into some of the foods that we eat every day. I like to spill this in my bathroom sink because just to sort of wash out the rest of that remaining ink. It is uh, water resistant, so it's also another thing to keep in mind. It is not going to stain or rot or anything like that in your homes. You could also take some paper towels and just sort of blot a little bit into that container and also just throw away in the trash. So let me just clean off this container. Alrighty, so I have a new container of water. You could also use, again, doesn't really matter in terms of temperature. I do sort of slightly see a temperature difference if we use warmer water. It dries a little bit quicker, from my experience, but it really also just depends on how much water we use. But there is no actual physical difference. So warm or cool, to be honest, it doesn't really matter. So now I'm just going to take my Sumi. Let's start off by making some swatches. Again, you either want to just to sort of be careful in this stage and not add too much. The Sumi is actually extremely strong in terms of pigment, so a little bit goes a long way. And just sort of be gentle in this process. So I have about 2 drops that I just applied. And I've already made some sort of mistakes by closing the container, because the ink does go everywhere. So please keep that in mind. If you again don't want to wear, if you're not comfortable of using sort of just your hands without any gloves, I would recommend then just getting some plastic gloves or some disposable gloves for the sake of the assignment. Alrighty, so I'm gonna again just use my large brush. So let's switch. So I'm gonna put that here. I'll put my container on my left. I'm just gonna blot in some of that swatch. You can also see there's a sort of a beautiful reaction happening here. It's fantastic. But you really have to just be mindful of how much water we use. You don't want to add too much. Now it's still a little too dark. I'm actually going to just switch over to this left and actually just dilute some of those drops that accidentally came onto the surface. It's still a little too dark. A little bit more water. And this is the whole point of this process, is really the amount of water is how much we can really understand that value. So if we can see how much water is being applied, you could also understand what sort of gradient you want to create in your landscape. Again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to speak at any time. That's better. Let's do this first one. And I do see sometimes the hair follicles on the Bristol or the synthetic brushes can actually come off, which is okay. So I have my first swatch. I'm going to wait for that to dry. Again, let me just hover over my hand. Let's see. Oh, you know what? My shadow foam is covering it. It's okay. We'll move the camera out slightly so we can see it again once it's fully dry. And now from that first swatch we made, I'm actually going to see if this is diluted enough so I can make my second one. You can see too also, it's very dark. Actually, that's a little too... No, you know what? Hold on, let's see how this looks. This might be too similar in color. But I'm already seeing there's a richness to this ink that is extremely different from the India. Add a little bit more. So I'm going to just slightly add it to sort of this slot here, middle right. Oop, I did get some on my paper, which is okay. I just have to clean off some of the ink so it doesn't sort of spread through my surfaces. You can see that's a big jump by just adding a little bit of water, or excuse me, a little bit of the ink. So while this was still wet, I can just quickly go over it. And I'm going to let that dry. You can see also some of it bled through on my paper, which is okay. And if that, for example, happens, you could also just take a quick paper towel that's slightly wet and remove as much as you can, but there's still going to be a little bit of a slight residue that's left, which is, you know, it can work for some of your drawings, but those of you who want to keep a nice clean surface, would highly recommend taking your time and really using the tape to kind of block out some of those areas so you can actually leave enough for the whites or the darks. Let's make the last. I'm going to cover the whole thing. And I'm just going to subtract some of this here with a little bit of just water. I already can see it starts to bleed, which is fantastic. You'll be able to see those differences. The more and more we add water. Oop, actually a little bit got on here. You can see right there, we can erase. The minute that we caught our mistake, you can take some paper towel, blot it, it's off. So I'm going to let this area dry. Again, sorry, I do apologize, the glare. You can start to slightly see it starts to get a little bit more clearer to visible to see. Now, did this make sense?
Yes.
Perfect. Do we have any questions or concerns? Okay. Let us start off now with our ink wash landscape. So I'm going to actually just remove some of the water on here just because the previous sheet will be underneath. I don't want this to bleed over my drawing. Okay. So that now I enlarge my camera. Okay. Let me just clean off my container so I can get ready for the next process. Alrighty, I have my water. Let me grab some paper towels just in case. I like to have two just in case for the sake of the demo. I'm gonna actually fold one into the 4, keep it on its side, and I have another one here that I'm gonna actually hold in one hand. So if I'm right-handed, I'll keep this in my left. So if I'm painting onto my landscape, I can just quickly remove some of the ink that I applied that I've made mistakes on. Just for the sake of the demo, we'll put that into, again, to practice just to see what happens. Now, again, keep in mind, I'm using that landscape from the internet, and I believe, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like it's from either like some beach landscape, like maybe Hawaii or maybe some other California beach landscape. But I wanted to sort of just, again, minimize too much of my picture plane. And again, think about the rules and sort of ideas of not only the value scale, but also think about what I've learned from previous assignments to kind of get my head around the process of looking at the landscape and getting an idea of how do I start, how do I begin in any process. So again, holistically, I like to think about this process as not worrying too much about the detail, just sort of applying large blocks of ink onto my sheet of paper to kind of get my general composition, thinking about my perspective. Where is my horizon line? Do I have any orthogonal lines that meet on my picture plane? And the tape is here in relationship to what we talked about from the previous assignment of the 1-point linear perspective, of really looking at your landscapes through the eyes of a window. And again, it also parallels with what Alberti talks about in the lecture from last assignment of thinking about how we visually look at outside of a window as a sort of perspective on our own landscapes. So this is something to just sort of consider. Again, I have a dry sheet of paper of my Strathmore 18 by 24 inch. Again, taping out the edges to kind of crop or eliminate some of those areas so I don't have to worry about my ink actually bleeding through. If you can, I would highly recommend trying to create a 2-inch, 1.5 inch or 2-inch border on all 4 sides, just to sort of kind of keep your drawing nice and clean. And I'm actually going to tape off one area of the top, just to sort of give that idea, that illusion of where the whitest whites are. And I notice right about here, there's a cloud that's at an angle. And I'm just going to take some tape. Now I'm actually going to cover up some of that area. And we'll remove it at the end because you'll see what happens once you add some tape in the beginning stages, because that, remember that your whitest whites are going to be what's taped off or what's not covered with ink. Okay. You want to gradually work from lights first, and then you gradually get darker and darker. But you also have to remember, if this is where a light source is coming from, and that's sort of the brightest whites, I'm also going to just tape that off just for the sake, again, for the demo, but also to show you how we can use the tape as a tool when we're creating our values. Okay. Now, again, I do have my container here. Just for the sake of the demo, it's on the sort of my left-hand side. I'm going to use my India ink because we have those available in our supply kits that I will be putting into my drawing. And I'm actually not going to be using this palette just for the sake of the demo, because I know some of you may not have any. So I'm actually going to add to my container of water 1 drop of ink. And this is what it looks like. 1 drop of ink. If you guys can see that. I'm just going to blend this together. And this is already too much water, but that's okay. In these stages, I'm going to take my small brush, and this is where it's You could also use your big brush, but I like to use the small brush at this stage. Or you know what? Yeah, let's keep to the small brush just so we can get that composition down. Now, I'm gonna make a very light sketch of my composition. I'm gradually adding a little bit of water at a time, a little bit of ink at a time, okay? You really wanna wait until this process is fully dry from your first layer to add another layer of ink. So for example, I have my paper towel next to me. Now that horizon line from the beach would probably be right around here, okay? And this is very light, very, very light. You can barely see it, which is fantastic because if I make any mistakes, I can quickly take my paper towel and remove it, okay? But just for the sake of the demo, we're gonna do that again. You really wanna think very loosely in this process. I'm not worrying about any detail, any sort of mark. I'm now gonna add some of that landscape in the background. You can kind of see from the glare of the light, it gets a little bit more visible, okay? And this again maps out all of my composition. So I can see where this is where that sort of the shore begins, the shore ends from the actual reference. Here's a few of the rocks. And I think the largest rock looks like it's right about here in my foreground. And again, those of you who are following along, you'll be able to see this much more clearly when you add just a little bit of water and just one drop of ink, and you can see that's covered. It is a little bit difficult to see in the camera, and I do apologize, but I'll actually add the next layer in about a few minutes. And then just sort of very loosely, not thinking about too much of those details, add some swatches of these marks to kind of highlight where my composition is. And this is a wet on wet process, excuse me, wet on dry process, because the surface of my paper is dry. Some of my palm trees in the background, and just get my general shape. Notice how fast I'm working. I'm just not worrying about any details. Here's some of my clouds. Okay. Now at this stage, it's very difficult to see, but this is great because I really want to gradually now add the next layer. But I also need to remember the fact that it's still wet. So if I add a mark on, or if I add another drop to my container, it will bleed if I add it wet on wet. So let's put that into practice. I'm gonna add 2 drops actually, excuse me. 2 more drops from the previous container. Again, just utilizing that's the same consistency in the same bottle or container. I'm now going to switch to my large brush. I'm going to clean off some of my smaller brushes. Again, get a nice viscosity of my ink. Really mix it in there. You don't want to just add a drop and just directly not blend from your container. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Again, and I like to always, for the sake of the assignment, blot in some of my brush onto a paper towel. So that's a sort of previous color before I get to my good sheet of paper. So remember, your paper towel is going to be a great resource to use. Now I'm going to start adding some of those darker marks. You can see there's a slight gradient. Okay, that's my first rock. Just kind of getting my composition in there. The second rock is right about here. Notice how slowly I'm working, how gradual this process is. You do not want to rush. And really paying attention to my values. Where are my next darks? Where are my next lights? And remembering the fact that things are going to change in every iteration of the drawing. And things can overlap and get slightly more abstract the more and more we start to add more ink. But it also becomes sort of trial and error to see how the ink will react to the actual surface of my paper. And your smaller brush is really when we get into the later marks of our drawings so we can work on details. And now I'm going to add a slight variant value in the background. There's that tint of blue that I want to showcase. And again, that will be my brightest whites. Okay, I'll move my hand over here. I'll hover it over the light so you can see. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's really, really light, very abstract. But then now I'm going to switch to my small brush and actually add in more ink. I'm going to jump to 5 drops. Now this is going to be a big jump. Just add it to my container. 5 more drops. Okay. That nice. Sorry about that. My camera went away. Okay. Take my brush again. Take my paper towel to see how that looks. You can see that's a lot more grayer. Now, let's add the next layers. And also, again, this is the third process of the value. So we started off really light. We added a hint of gray. Now we're adding a little bit darker gray than that. Okay. And I want to also be mindful in terms of, like, for example, just hover over my rock, my first rock. You can see this area here is slightly lighter. And that also factors in to understand where my light source is. And I'll also provide this image onto the modules tab. So those of you who want to work with the same image for the sake of just practicing, you can as well. You can see now it's slightly getting darker. And notice I'm sort of moving the brush onto that surface gradually. And I did have a lot of students also inquire about working upside down. That also helps to sort of figure out the composition. Notice it gets darker and darker. Here are my waves. There's also a cast shadow here. Notice that starts to pull up with water here and here because there's a lot of water in those surfaces. Also need to factor that in. And I kind of want a sort of painterly abstract, again, image of my landscape so you can really get the hang of the material and really understand how different some of those washes can be. Add more to my sky. Notice how quickly I'm working. And that horizon should have a nice value. So really, from this horizon line, it should be a nice sort of bright and then gradually gets darker and more saturated with ink. And I like to sometimes also take my paper towel, sort of blot in some of those areas to remove some of the water. But you could also make some really interesting textures. And I'm not applying any pressure. I'm just literally letting gravity do its job and just making it drop onto that surface. And the same thing here. Like if I don't want that pool of water to show up, you can see all that ink is starting to come up. Okay. Now we can get a sort of slight idea of where my darks will be, where my lights will be in this early stage. And this is why we have about 2 weeks to work on the assignment, is because you need to be patient and wait for those areas to dry. Okay. Because a part about this assignment is not really rushing the inks. Okay. You really want to take your time, sort of see what happens in terms of trial and error. Now, I'm going to, just for the sake of the demo, move on to the next stage. I'm going to shake my container. I'm going to add now 7 more drops. Now I have to also keep in mind that this is going to be really dark compared to my previous swatch. Get that nice and mixed in. Okay. Again, before any attempts to apply it to my paper, I always blot it to my paper towel, you can see that real big difference between those darks. A little bit just goes a long way. Alrighty. Gonna work on my foreground with my brightest dark, or my darkest dark, I should say, excuse me. So my rocks here. Go over those surfaces. Also go over the water. You can see now it's getting a little bit darker. You want to gradually work in this process, guys. Take your time. Blotting some of these areas. I'm not worrying about any details, not even at these stages. Just kind of covering in some of those areas. You want to build upon that texture of the sand. You want to build upon that texture of the foliage or the rocks or the sort of areas within the drawing that you can start to really see how it starts to unfold, unwind, and see what will work best in your process of your drawing. There's a value here, slight gradient. There's also one here. Notice I'm just going really quickly just to cover that ground. Just kind of get that nice sort of abstract value with my inks. And I want to show some of my brush marks kind of much more loosely. Notice I'm working much in a sort of broader stroke, kind of zigzag, front and back, left to right, and then going over it again. Just really pushing into that paper to kind of make it bleed through the surface, not too much. Okay. And now I'm going to do something radically different. And this is where it gets a little scary, but don't be scared. I'm going to remove my top, my India. I'm just going to place it onto my side. I'm going to take my small brush, and this is where it gets interesting. I'm just going to dip it directly into my India. And this is where the magic happens. Now I'm going to add a little bit of dark. And again, I'm sort of jumping the gun in this process, but just to show everybody that the more and more we actually wait for the areas of our drawing to dry, the more and more sort of mindful we need to be when we work on our landscapes, because I don't want too much of my blacks to bleed. And really, I'm going to let it sit for a second before I sort of jump the gun and add too much black. But for the sake of the demo, we're going to actually work a little bit more quickly. And it's just wonderful to see it bleed through. I'm going to wet that area. I'm going to take my brush while it's still wet. Now I can start to play with that value and start to move it around. And I know there's foliage back there, so I need to make some marks. Some sort of dabbing onto that surface. And I could also remove some of it. Just add my paper towel a little bit of gravity. There's that larger rock. And I've actually seen students have fun in this process to really get experimental. You could also apply a little bit of salt on these areas while it's still wet, and you'll see a really fantastic reaction to the salt. It dries out some of those surfaces, and it gives a nice sort of texture of almost a gradient. But I'm just sort of slightly going quickly just for the sake of the demo. So you can see what happens when we add too much black. But it could also work to your advantage. To really see how these marks come alive. Do we have any questions? Am I going too fast? Okay, no questions. Okay. I've also seen the process of using your droplet from your India ink as an actual tool. So if you want to make some series of straight lines, you could also do that. Palm trees in the background. Really thinking about how far that is from my landscape. On the water. I need to be mindful of thinking about that value of the water touching the sand and using that white, really being mindful of my white surface as my bright. And some of the paper towels kind of mesh those areas together. Okay. Now I need to wait for this area to dry before I add more layers on top of it, because it's starting to buckle too much, that if I apply more ink directly onto the surface of the paper, it starts to bleed. So I'm going to wait for this area to dry and come back to it a little bit later. What questions or concerns do we have about this assignment or for the demo? Okay. And then in a few minutes, I'm actually going to remove some of that actual tape. I'm going to stop the recording.